Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. This is going to be a little bit of a different video that I tend to do, but the reason why I thought that I would do it is because I thought that it was decently educational when it came down to it, and I thought that it would give me a reason to explain overall why I think that this punch is important in boxing, what it can be used for, and overall, I thought that I would kind of cap off overall this video that I've seen. But anyways, I was sent an article overall by my father, and of course my father, he is mainly the one that got me into boxing when it came down to it. It actually took me a certain amount of years to get into boxing, and later on, I think all in all that I eventually overall became more obsessed with the sport than what my father even eventually was in his earlier days. But when it comes down to it, I've sparred a decent amount of times, sparred a decent amount of people, and when it comes down to it, even though I can't claim that I was a professional boxer or anything like that, you know, what I can say is that I do know my 2 cents about boxing. And one of the most important punches, if you're in boxing, or overall if you're training in boxing, or if you're sparring, of course, is the jab. And this video, of course, by I believe this one former amateur boxer, maybe even former professional boxer, but I do not necessarily know his background very much. That's just personally what I heard from the article. But this person overall, Mr. Tony Jeffries, I think overall that what he had to say, I think that it was decently educational, and I thought that he was right on the money. And one fighter, of course, that he mentioned overall, Mr. Canelo Alvarez, who, of course, in my opinion, is the current #1 pound-for-pound king. He overall mentioned that Canelo Alvarez has a quote-unquote killer punch, and that killer punch apparently is the jab to the body. Now, of course, the jab to the body, when you take a look at most boxing matches, it doesn't seem overall like it really takes a whole lot of intelligence. It doesn't really seem overall like it's very, very difficult to perform. And to a degree, maybe you would say that it's not super duper difficult to perform. But a lot of boxers out there, they're not really willing to go to the body with the jab because a lot of them feel like they don't have the ability. And of course, if you've ever sparred before, and if you don't do it correctly, and if you don't get out of the zone quick enough, of course, you can possibly get hit to the face with something if you're not out of the zone quick enough. But the jab to the body, in my opinion, or the jab in general, is something that, in my opinion, has to be taught to anyone that is going into boxing. Or if you're going to be a great professional boxer overall, you have to instill the jab in there. The jab, in my opinion, even though, of course, it's not a punch that is usually going to deliver the knockout, in a way it actually does deliver the knockout. It is not necessarily the gold when it comes down to it, but what it is the key that basically unlocks the treasure chest to get to the gold. What do I mean by that? Basically, what it is, basically, if you're an artist and if you like to draw, say something like that, let me just compare it this way. Sure, certain people take a look at a blank piece of paper and they don't know what to do with it. But certain people overall with a pencil, they can come up with a masterpiece overall within a matter of just a few minutes, or overall within a certain amount of time. Basically, the best of boxers overall can do this with the jab. And the jab, in my opinion, really is debatably probably the most important punch in all of boxing because it can be not only used for a multi-purpose tool, but it can set up so many different punches and so many different types of combinations. And I think that Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez, I think overall that he has learned overall to perform this punch to a very, very great art. And when you take a look at Canelo Alvarez, yes, he does use that punch to the body. And when I was watching overall a video by this one channel that I hold in decently high regard, of course, Mr. Chronicles of Judo 144, and you can check out that video that I reviewed by him. It was a Patreon video. Like I said, I'm not going to review many videos by him because it's Patreon content, and of course, that is meant to be paid for, so I'm not going to review his videos very, very often, at least the ones on Patreon, but you can go ahead and check it out. It was a discussion overall that I had that I asked overall, is Canelo Alvarez on his way to the greatest of all time? And I believe I posted it about a couple to maybe a few weeks ago now. And one thing that Judo overall said in that video that I actually would tend to agree with is that he said that Canelo Alvarez in a way reminded him of Rocky Marciano. Now, of course, people would take a look at Rocky Marciano, they'll take a look at highlights maybe after this, and they'll say, what? How do you think that Rocky Marciano relates to Canelo Alvarez? I can see why he made that comparison. Because Canelo Alvarez, when you talk about especially him being in the 168-pound divisions and maybe even moving up to 175, especially maybe to face an Artur Beterbiev or Dimitri Bivol, or even if he's going to face a Jamal Charlo or Demetrius Bobo Andrade or a David Benavidez, all those guys are naturally taller and lengthier than what Canelo Alvarez is. Now, of course, Canelo, in terms of stature, we all know that he can pretty much handle himself somewhat within those weight divisions, or especially at 160 and 168. There's no problem with that. But to be on the level of a Canelo Alvarez, you have to have a transcendent skill set. Not even just a good or great skill set. You have to be an all-time great to do what Canelo Alvarez has done, in my opinion. And a big part of the reason why he's so successful, and if you want to really take a look at the fights for yourself, I think overall that some of the fights for some of you, people out there that really admire Canelo, and some of you that, really, love watching some of Canelo Alvarez's fights, or for those of you that really, are just interested in the sweet science of the sport and the breakdowns, go ahead and watch Canelo Alvarez versus Danny Jacobs. Now, that fight was very, very decently competitive, but that was one of the fights, in my opinion, that when I took a look at that, I said, wow, Canelo Alvarez is really transcending into a very, very all-time greatly skilled boxer. His jab, in my opinion, in that fight was very, very crisp. Now, against Gennady Golovkin, that was a fighter that maybe you could debate had a little bit of a better jab than a Canelo Alvarez, but Canelo was still able to outperform him. But Canelo, you can tell, he has a very, very great jab. He doesn't even have a good jab. In my opinion, he has a great jab. And not only does he jab to the head, but he jabs to the body. And jabbing to the body, when it comes down to it, it is very, very vital. And just to bring up the comparison once again about Rocky Marciano, the reason why that is because Canelo Alvarez, just like Rocky Marciano, a lot of the times when he was up against some of those quote-unquote heavyweights of the day, now a lot of people, of course, will say, well, Rocky Marciano, he wasn't really going up against heavyweights. They were pretty much natural light heavyweights. Rocky Marciano was pretty much a natural light heavyweight as well. Rocky Marciano, Ezzard Charles, Joe Louis, Jersey Joe Walcott, all those guys at max would rehydrate at about 190 pounds. They probably would not even make it to that weight. At least that's what I know. I know Rocky Marciano and, Jersey Joe Walcott, they pretty much rehydrated at around 187 to 188 pounds. So if you're just talking about rehydration, shit, Rocky Marciano and Ezzard Charles, if they fought today, they maybe could even fight at super middleweight. So basically, that's just how things were back then. It is what it is. And Floyd Patterson was another person that was kind of naturally built smaller, and he, eventually, of course, fought at heavyweight, when it came down to it, and he ended up getting beat up bad by Sonny Liston. But anyways, not to digress, just to head in straight into the Rocky Marciano conversation about Canelo. When you take a look at Rocky Marciano, there is similarities, because what Rocky Marciano basically is looking to do, he's looking to go for it on you, he's looking to break you down, but there is a reason why he was so successful. Because if Rocky Marciano just went straight in there with his chin wide up in the air when it came down to it, and just completely tried to outbox some of these fighters that had a severe reach advantage over him. A lot of people don't know this about Rocky Marciano, but when Rocky Marciano fought some of those guys, he would be outreached sometimes by like 10 inches. I'm not bullshitting. Some people can, they may not believe me, but you can do the research on this, I believe. Rocky Marciano, I believe, had the shortest heavyweight reach ever, at least out of any heavyweight champion. The reach that he had was 67 inches. And what that basically means is that this man was fighting at the heavyweight division, or at least overall at the day probably would have been natural light heavyweights, and he pretty much had the same reach as a Miguel Cotto or a Manny Pacquiao, which was 67 inches. So Rocky Marciano, he cannot just go straight in there and try to outbox him when it came down to what he had to do is that, yes, even though he was a little bit of a bull when it came down to it, and sometimes he was a little bit sloppy, Rocky Marciano actually was a more intelligent boxer than what a lot of people give him credit for. Because you cannot overall be outreached by that amount and just get in on your opponent if you're just a complete idiot looking overall for the knockout. Rocky Marciano had to go in there. He had to develop a low crouch. He had to make sure that his head was somewhat low, that he could avoid some of those punches. And he had to work in on the jab. Sometimes I believe that he would have the jab to the body. He would have the jab to the head. And then, of course, he would set up a great left hook or a great right hand or whatever punch overall that he planned to land. And Rocky Marciano, of course, for those of you that don't know, Rocky Marciano was one of the all-time great athletes in sports history. When you overall do your research on Rocky Marciano, there's certain people overall that said not only did he punch hard, but he never would stop punching. There's been records stating that Rocky Marciano sometimes would run over 15 miles per day when it came down to returning training camps. Rocky Marciano overall, he literally was one of the meanest built overall athletes of the generation, but a lot of people overall don't tend to know that. He overall was actually one of the most gifted athletes of all time when it came down to. Now, when you take a look at his skill set, it looks a little bit raw. But at the end of the day, I understand the comparison between Rocky Marciano and Canelo Alvarez. It's kind of the same thing with Mike Tyson. When you take a look at Mike Tyson in the early days, now Mike Tyson, in my opinion, because he lost a certain amount of the bigger fights, he can't necessarily be compared on that level because he lost so many of the big fights in his career. But when you take a look at Mike Tyson, what did Mike Tyson do in his early days, especially because he was shorter in stature and because I believe he only had a 72-inch reach? Now, that's not too bad for a guy that's about 5'10" when it comes down to it. But at the end of the day, sometimes he's facing heavyweights that, they may even have an 80-something inch reach when it comes down to. So basically, what did Mike Tyson have to do? He had to bob and weave. He had to get his head out of the way. He had to keep his hands up, the quote-unquote peekaboo style. And then on top of that, he had to work in there with his jab. That's what Mike Tyson had to do. It's sort of the same thing with Floyd Patterson, who was another Cus-D'Amato, I believe, or Cus-D'Amato trained fighter. They had very similar styles when it came down to it. But Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, I just thought that I would talk about that because I thought that that would be an interesting little video. I thought that what Tony Jeffries overall posted, I thought that it was a very decently educational video. I thought that he was right on the money with the information overall that he was giving out. And I thought that it would just be an interesting little video to talk about because I do think that the jab is a big part of the reason of why Canelo Alvarez is as great as what he is today. And the jab or the lead hand can be used for a multitude of things. Not only to jab at the body, not only to jab to the head and use as a point scorer, but it can be overall used as a rangefinder. It can be used for defense. It can be used also for the manipulation of your opponent's movements. It can be used overall to blind your opponent. Even Deontay Wilder, for example, had a decent jab. He didn't have a great jab, in my opinion. He didn't necessarily have a Muhammad Ali or Larry Holmes or Tyson Fury-like jab. But he at least overall had a decent enough jab to blind certain opponents, because if he did not at least have a decent jab, he would have never gotten past Luis Ortiz in those two fights, because that was the main reason why he was able to get Luis Ortiz. He was able to blind him for a quick second, trick him with the jab, and he was able to land that right hand. So that's overall how he was able to win that fight when it came down to it. So Wilder, at least somewhat, especially with the skill set that he has, he deserves overall a little bit of credit for how far he somewhat has gotten. But it is what it is. But anyways, I just thought overall that that was a very interesting video. Thought that it was decently educational, and I thought that I would just put my 2 cents in there. But anyways, we'll see all in all later on what happens with Mr. Canelo Alvarez. I am, of course, always excited to watch him fight because I do believe that he is a true treat to watch. And we'll see all in all what happens. But go ahead and watch some of the other all-time great fighters use jabs to the body or use the jab overall in general, whether it be a Mike Tyson, a Rocky Marciano, a Floyd Mayweather Jr., a Canelo Alvarez, even a Manny Pacquiao, when it comes down to it, had a very decent jab, in my opinion, even though certain people would say that sometimes it was sloppy. But the jab, in my opinion, of course, could be debated as the most important punch in all of boxing. Of course, it's not usually going to deliver the knockout blow, but in a way it does. When it comes down to it, it just takes time, and it takes discipline and preparation, But anyway, that's pretty much about it for this video. I just thought that I would talk about that. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.